Just checking for the online participants. Am I audible now? Thank you. So I'll quickly repeat what I said, since I think there was an issue with the microphone. So in this presentation, we'll be looking at the tools which are available for assessing the maturity of a DHIS2 or HMIS implementation in country. We'll have some examples of how we've used these assessments in the past and which are the ongoing assessments in the Asia region. And then in similar lines, we have some toolkits developed for assessing the capacity of DHIS to core teams in countries and how those toolkits could be used for creating a capacity building plan for the core teams who are responsible for the DHIS implementation. So before going to the tools, let's try to understand what are the foundation pillars of information systems or any system in particular. When you are building a system, you need inputs from people, process, and technology. And each of these components plays a very important role in building a cohesive approach towards designing and developing an information system. And when we're talking about health information systems, these components are much more crucial because health is a very important subject for any country. So let's see what makes a good DHIS or an HMIS implementation. So we'll start with people. So we need a constant buy-in from the decision makers. The top level support is very much crucial. When you plan for implementation of HIS in country, and when you're planning for a long-term implementation, you need investments as well. Where you invest, you know that where your investments should go, in what human resource capacity, in what technology, in capacity building, and how to set up routines and culture for data use for a long-term success in terms of maintaining sustainability of the HMIS implementations in country. When it comes to DHIS implementations in country, since HISP groups work very closely with the Ministries of Health, therefore a close dialogue between the Minister of Health and HISP groups is recommended and should happen to approach that the information systems which are being developed are developed in a sustainable manner, and capacity building and data use become big priorities for the implementation to achieve. And so that you're able to retain well qualified and well trained staff over a longer period of time to ensure we have a sustainable HMI solutions. Next, we come to the process where the aspirations are to have good data quality and a culture of data use, where you can do routine reviews of your data and you can do the routine reviews of your data, and systematically you're able to monitor the performance of how the indicators are performing over time. So these processes, of course, take time and they need a lot of investment. So planning for these aspirations at the beginning of the DHIS2 or the HMIS implementation is one of the key criteria. And we see that many countries struggle in that respective process, but they don't have clear indicators which shows them that these are the areas where you're lacking or these are the areas where you need more support or more investments. In that scenarios, these tools that have been developed help you to get a clear picture of your DHIS2 assessment implementation and what areas, what are your bottlenecks, what are areas of improvement. And when you have this clear picture, it becomes easier to guide your investments towards those specific identified areas. Technology is important but it's not more important than the people and the processes. If the people and the processes are moving the right direction, the technology can play a assisting role in meeting the aspirations that a country has with respect to its health information systems. But technology needs long-term investment and a sustainable infrastructure and a continuous needs assessment so that you're able to identify gaps. And a part of your investment also is reserved for improving the technology because as we see, things progress very fast when it comes to technologies. And as you scale up your information systems in country, you'll need more technology support to support that expansion. So as part of the DHIS2 maturity profile, we look into all these three pillars and we further segregate it into different components and programs and the overall HMIS. And then we ask questions to the corresponding people to get the right answers so that we can assess the situation of the existing HMIS or DHIS2 in country. So let me introduce the DHIS to maturity profile tool. A couple of years back, the University of Oslo team started working with the Global Fund to build a framework, a monitoring tool and assessment tool, which could help any country to assess the current maturity of its DHIS to implementation, and not only give them the current picture, but also highlight the key bottlenecks, the key areas of improvement, so that the countries have the right picture of what they're doing good and where they need to improve and what areas need immediate investment, so that they could use that information to convince the donors, the partners, to invest money in their respective countries. So the framework serves as a vital tool for targeted and measurable interventions in HIS strengthening. It looks at the sustainability of overall HIS and also specific health programs. The tool helps you to plan your investments and your DHIS implementation strategically, and it kind of helps you to align your donor interventions and the health objectives which a country wants to achieve. So we look at importance of measuring the progress on system strengthening, and it's a part of a continuous assessment. So if you've done the assessment, say in year 2024, and you've identified your weaknesses, your bottlenecks and priorities, 2 years down the line, you have got investments to work on those specific areas. You could do this process again to see whether there's a change from the last level of assessment and what new challenges have come up and what new um, new achievements have been done in that respective area. So we're looking at the implementation, but we're also integrating research, monitoring, and evaluation as part of the entire process, where you assess the HMIS as a whole entity by going into each of the components and assessing that in detail. So how the tool is supporting the country is to measure and understand if the country is progressing well on their HIS beyond the routine activities. We all know that the facilities are supposed to report data. They have to do reporting on time, and then data has to be collected, it has to be analyzed, has to be presented. But there is much more to data collection, which needs to be emphasized upon. And then that kind of completes the whole cycle of data collection, data quality assessment, data use, and then it again brings back to your data collection processes. So it kind of helps you to look a level above to the routine activities that you do in your countries. It helps you to identify areas where you need more in-depth evaluation or monitoring or continuous assessment. It gives you a good indication that how is the country performing right now and how prepared it is to scale up the information system both vertically and horizontally. Are implementations strong enough that you can move from aggregate to client level reporting? Are your implementations strong enough that you can include more health programs into the national HMIS? So these questions are answered when you look at the assessment, when you do the assessment, and when you get the results, you get to know where you are. And if you want to reach the next level, then what interventions or what changes you need to bring to be able to become a more sustainable information system. And in general, it kind of tells the country what are the areas where the investment is required, and so that these measured requirements could be shared with the donors for requesting support. We're looking at three key components, which is the foundational component, the aggregate component, and the tracker component, because each of them have specific prerequisites and skill sets required to be utilized in a specific country with respect to HMIS. So we're looking at encouraging investments in the DHIS2 capacity, the core capacity, that is the foundational areas. So that is the starting point where we assess. We look at the foundational areas, try to see where each of these foundation area is, how mature it is at the present moment, and what weaknesses are there at present, and how those weaknesses can be improved further. So using this maturity profile, you get a platform where you can align these findings across your investments and donor interventions, and you can give them a clear picture. So these are the areas that we need support, and then we could ask questions from the donors that which of them is able to fund us in order to make improvements in those specific areas. So now you have clear representation of your immediate priorities, and then you can clearly align those priorities to donor intervention so that there is no overlap between the donor interventions, and each of them has a clear indication of what activities a donor intends to support based on their priority areas and how they can jointly work together in a country to have this direct support. So as I mentioned, we're looking at three core areas. We start with the foundational, which is the maturity of the key foundational domains, which includes leadership and governance, strategy and investment, DHIS to security and compliance, the core team for DHIS to maintenance, the quality of DHIS to metadata and organization units, the training capacity of the end users, the availability of facility and population profile data for denominators, and the infrastructure available in the country. Because each of these foundational aspects kind of influence your implementations as you start collecting aggregate data and then you mature to client level data collection. So it's important to analyze in the same order that your foundational areas should be in a good condition for you to be able to collect aggregate data across the country from all the national programs. And if you want to graduate from aggregate data collection to client level data collection, then your foundation area should at least be at a certain level so that you're able to support the expansion of data collection from aggregate to client based. Okay? So in each of these domains, we have questions, we have assessment criteria which are defined, and the toolkit has guidance given that how you're measuring that specific criteria. So we're looking at not yet achieved, we're looking at adequate, we're looking at not yet achieved, early progress, adequate, and mature. So based on these classifications available, you can select that at what level that particular component is at right now. And we have the University of Oslo team has developed a DHIS2 system where you can import this data and then you can get reports out of the system where you get the entire maturity profile with the results, with the key interventions which are highlighted, that what are the current status of each of these components and what are the weakness areas, what are the strengths, and where the country can invest moving forward. So let's see so these are just random profiles that we have generated for two countries, just to show you the difference between country one and country two. If you compare with the country one, you see more or less they have adequate or mature status in the foundational areas. So the orange ones which you see, they are early progress. The light green ones are adequate and the dark green ones are mature. Okay? But if you compare this with country two, most of their foundational components are in early progress. Okay? So they have a weak foundation. And if you have a weak foundation, you can't sustain any information system for a longer term. Okay? So you need to work on strengthening your foundational systems. Then you move on to aggregate data collection. So you assess each of your health program with respect to the data collection protocols, data use protocols, data quality protocols, infrastructure, user training. So each of these components is assessed separately for each of the national program, and which gives you an end result that this is where you are with respect to HIV, TB, malaria, and both for aggregate as well as tracker data collection. So you could see that the country two has not so good foundational areas, although they have went ahead and implemented aggregate systems and implemented tracker systems. But still, if you see, they've gone the entire road. But then if you look at this, the quality of the existing implementations, everything is at early progress because the foundational areas were found weak. So if your foundational areas are weak, then it's difficult for you to sustain implementations both for aggregate and tracker, especially tracker, because it needs a lot more preparation, lot more investments, lot more human resource capacity to be able to sustain tracker implementations for a long term. Okay? So in the next set of slides, we have some recommendations where we tell you that if you want to scale up to trackers, then what are the areas that you should focus upon? And at least they should be at a certain level for you to start investing in building trackers in a specific country. So if you're looking at the aggregate portion of the DHIS2 profile, so if you are looking at adding or enhancing new DHIS2 aggregate programs, or you want to do scaling up of your aggregate programs, you should at least target that your foundational areas are in early progress in the maturity profile, so that you know that your foundations are more or less okay, and that allows you to expand your aggregate data collection further. If any of your foundational areas are not yet achieved, based on the assessment, then those areas need to be addressed on priority. And you'll see these foundational areas are quite basic, but these basic areas become a more cohesive unit because each of them has a very strong impact on your HMIS implementation. So leadership and governance, if you do not have a strong leadership at helm in the HMIS department or the Ministry of Health, then the decisions are not taken that strongly and they're not implemented that strongly. Therefore, you need to have strong leadership and governance. Strategy and investment, you need to have costed work plans for at least next 5 years, where you have ensured funding for different components which take into your HMIS implementation. So that is very important. And you should have a strong strategy and investment on how you will scale up your HMIS for the next 5 years and what are the objectives that you want to achieve. So that should be in place because that gives the entire work the direction it needs. So if the countries do not have a strategy to work with, then it's difficult for them to measure their progress across the years. Hence, it's very important. We deal with data, and it's very important to maintain the security of data. Hence, DHIS security and compliance is a very crucial component, especially when you're dealing with case-based records in your trackers. So that also needs to be at least at early progress or adequate maturity before you even if you're collecting aggregate data, still the data security is a big component where the investments needs to go. We need to have a strong core team in the country. So we look at the core team assessment toolkits which have been developed and how they can be used to measure the capacity of your existing core team. And there are many countries where they do not have a DHIS to core team. So there's guidance available where they tell you that this is an ideal composition of a core team. So if you're trying to set a core team now, these are the positions that you need to have as core positions, and what positions can be contributory positions, optional positions. And for each of these positions, there are detailed job descriptions defined, which can be used for recruiting the staff on those specific positions. Okay. The metadata is the foundation block of your information system. Hence, it's important that it is of good quality. And it will have some niggling issues. All countries have small issues with their metadata. But if something big, which kind of hampers that you can't use that data or can't analyze that data because of metadata anomalies, then of course that needs to be looked into. So that needs to be at least adequate level so that you can further build upon your HMI solution. End users are very important because they are the real users of your system. So their capacity is very important to be assessed and to be measured. And that is a continuous process which needs to be followed. So therefore, each of these foundational areas is very important to be at least at the early progress or adequate level so that you can further build on your HMIS, but in parallel, you can also make changes, make improvements to your foundational areas. Okay. Coming to tracker or individual data collection, it is a potentially large investment because it needs investments in human resource, needs investment in devices, needs investments in personnel, needs investment in processes. So you're looking at a large endeavor, which has to be planned properly with investments defined for each of these components. So it's important to get a buy-in from a country, from a program that they're ready to graduate from aggregate data collection to tracker-based data collection or individual data collection. You will need a constant funding support for sustaining the tracker implementation as you scale it up. So because you'll need support in developing your tracker reporting forms or individual reporting forms. You need support for its implementation. You will need support for training. You'll need support for continued technical support. So the funding has to be aligned properly. So if you're looking at your tracker implementations and you do not have a proper investment plan available, then we need to take a step back. We should develop a proper investment plan and then move towards the implementation of the tracker. As I mentioned, we're looking for data and especially client data, which is very important in terms of maintaining its security. Therefore, if there are no legislations or policies available for data privacy and you don't have standards for, say, e-health or digital health strategy, then we should look at the countries who have adopted similar strategies and have tried to implement those and take examples from those and see if they could be implemented in a country. So each of the countries right now are developing their data protection policies and data protection guidelines. So we need to ensure that we have those in place since we're dealing with public data, and that too for health. And so it's very sensitive. So we need to have this figured out before we plan to implement the tracker model. Now, these are general recommendations. We have seen countries who have went ahead and implemented trackers without the lack of these and with the lack of these policies. And we have gone to different countries and done assessments, and we ask a very specific question on privacy impact assessment, whether it was carried out or not. And none of the countries have till date responded that they did a privacy impact assessment before implementing a tracker program. So it comes as a recommendation that when you're implementing trackers, make sure you have certain guidelines available which will protect the data that you're collecting, and you should have proper legislations built around it. Then coming to the capacity of the development of the tracker programs, your individual data collection and supporting the long-term implementation, you should look at the capacity of how well your DHIS to core team knows about how individual data collection works in DHIS2, what processes are involved, how that data has to be managed, and how you can convert your individual data into aggregate information, which will eventually get utilized for doing your analysis. So that capacity and competence should be available, and that should be assessed, that you have that capacity in place for you able to sustain your tracker programs for a longer sustainable time. Infrastructure, again, you need devices, you need connectivity, you need servers, you need user support. So as you expand your implementations from aggregate to case-based, a lot of investment would be required to be done in these areas. So you need to plan for this, to assess the current situation with respect to infrastructure. Are your servers able to handle the caseload, which will come up when you move to individual data collection? Do the health facilities have enough connectivity to be able to use tracker in real time, or if they do data entry later on? And whether if you want to use mobile devices, then whether you have a proper distribution plan of mobile devices and their maintenance moving forward. So all of these factors have to be taken into account when you start planning for tracker implementations in countries. So these are suggestions, but we see that in reality, there are gaps which are found in each of the country and the way they implemented things. But then the maturity tool gives you a fair assessment of fine, you are there, but even being there, how you're performing, that is more important to know. And within an ongoing implementation, what are your areas which need improvement? So then you could start planning from then onwards that fine, we have a tracker implementation, it's working okay, it's working well, but still we are lacking in these areas which need support and which should be strengthened as a recommendation from the maturity assessment. Therefore, when you assess your tracker programs using the maturity profile, you get a reflection of its current performance, its strengths, its areas of improvement and bottlenecks which could be further worked upon. So when we're saying that you want to implement tracker programs, so make sure your foundational areas are at least early progress, that's the least, but the preference is that they should be at the etiquette level. And if you're talking about case-based data collection, your DHIS security and compliance policies and processes should be at least at the etiquette level. Okay? And we see that a lot of countries do not have expertise in-house available for the security and compliance. And the HISP groups are slowly building their capacities in this area. So they could, of course, guide you. But then this is a very important component when it comes to measuring the DHIS2 implementations maturity and looking at the maturity of the tracker implementations in country. Then within the overall DHIS2 implementation, you need to have continuous improvements. So the focus should be on continued investment. It's not a one-time process that you have started something and things will keep running on its own. No, they won't. You'll have to be continuously involved in carrying out routine assessments of your current HMI's functioning. And then you need to, because at each year as your implementation progresses, the priorities will change, the investments will change, and you will have new areas where you need more support. And if you are mature in one particular component, then you have to graduate to the next component, and that needs a different level of investments to be done. Okay. Therefore, you need to plan in a way that you give equal importance to each of these foundational areas and you build on them together as a consolidated unit so that continuous improvements keep on happening in each of these areas and you're not focusing just on one area and neglecting the other. So you need to make a more consolidated implementation approach where you can focus on each of these areas in a more cohesive manner to have a strong foundation and a strong HMIS implementation. So this was an overview of the DHIS to maturity profile, what it does and how it helps the ministries of health in the organizations to assess the current capacity, the current status, the current maturity of their DHIS to implementation, and how they can use the results to approach the donors by identifying clear priorities and your plans and strategy so that they could see that where their funds are going and they could make more planned investments along with the other donors who are working in the same country. So looking at one consolidated investment plan and strategy, which a country can create using the results of the majority profile and presenting it to the donors in a joint meeting and seeking funds for those respective areas which are identified. So how these assessments can be done? So these assessments can be done independently as well. So we have this toolkit available on the DHIS website. It's an Excel-based toolkit where you can internally assess your capacity as well. But if you want to do it in a more formal way, where you want to bring in consultants and experts who can meet each of your national programs and ask questions and try to assess their strengths and areas of improvement, then you could engage with the HISP groups who are responsible for working with the Ministry of Health in your country to do this assessment formally. And in the Asia region, we have been doing assessments in a joint manner. So where, for example, we have recently in Laos, where HISP Vietnam has been implementing DHIS for last 10 years. And the team from India went to went to Laos, met all the national programs and the leadership team at the Department of Planning and Finance. And then they assessed the current capacity of each of the departments and worked with the HISP Vietnam team to get as much information we could get from them, but also get a user's perspective of where they feel they are right now with respect to data collection policies, data use policies, data analysis capacity, human resource infrastructure, everything. So now we're interpreting the results of those respective assessments that we carried out, and we'll be submitting a formal report to the Ministry of Health that this is what the assessment or the majority profile says about the Lao DHIS implementation. So if any country is interested to get these assessments done, you can reach out to your HIS groups. They will facilitate these assessments in your country, and you can very well reach out to the donors that you want to get this assessment done and you would like to have some investments or support from the donors to support this assessment. And that is also one of the areas which could be explored. So in the session tomorrow on the development partners, we'll have a presentation from the HIS Center where they'll give further guidance on how you can use the majority profile to have one consolidated country work plan or country requirements, which could be shared with the potential donors and funders to get funding for those areas of support which have been highlighted as part of the assessment. So you'll get to know more on that tomorrow. So before I move to the update on the current assessments which are ongoing, are there any specific questions from the audience? Yeah.
So I think it is recommended that is DHS to service that or starting the presentation or right after.
So yeah, I mean, so the tool is DHIS to maturity profile, but it's platform agnostic. You can ask the same questions to any country who is not using DHIS at present, but using any other information systems. But because the questions around the which are part of the maturity profile are applicable to any information system which they're using. So it's not predominantly focused on DHIS as well. There are DHIS to specific questions, but still you can generalize them and ask them to the existing context. So it's not necessary that you do this assessment after implementing DHIS2. Even before implementing DHIS2, you can do this assessment with your current platform, that how this platform is performing on these areas, because it's not only a platform, it's about human resource capacity, it's about infrastructure, it's about policies. So you can assess your current state of affairs in the country. And even before implementing DHIS2, you'll get to know that these are the areas which need improvement, which can be your point of focus when you start DHIS2 implementations in country. So we understand the Cambodia is transitioning to DHIS2. And we also looked at Vietnam example that they are slowly migrating their national information system to DHIS2. So they could do this assessment any point of time and get the, and I think it would help them to make a more focused plan of implementation when they know that in the existing implementation, these were the areas which require more support, and how DHIS2 can help in bridging that gap which was there. Okay, any more questions?
I'm JP. I'm with the World Bank. So my question is for our colleagues from the company, Ministry of Health. So they actually did recently, through the help of WHO, like some sort of maturity assessment as well, but it's more on a larger digital readiness. So our question for now would be, is there some online repository where we can find the questions for the maturity assessment that we're describing? And then we try to map out if we were able to capture the basic elements you're outlining. And I think we're going to take it from there.
Yeah, so the assessment toolkit is available on the DHIS2 website. So you could download from there. I can quickly see if this is the correct link. So yeah, so these are the key components, this domains which are defined, and then for each of the domains you have these questions or statements that you need to assess. So these questions are available online, so we can put the link of the latest version of the tool in the presentation, and can also share in the conference material. So you can review these questions, and you can of course match that whether these components were assessed in the previous assessment. And then of course we could do a subsequent assessment which is thoroughly based on the HMIS components, because I think that was more broader with respect to digital readiness in the country. But these are more fine-tuned questions which are focusing on the HMIS aspect of it. Okay, any more questions?
Thanks for your presentation. This is Aisha from Jordan. I have a question regarding the questionnaire or elements in the assessment itself. Are these standard for all regions, or could be customized depends on?
So yeah, so these are just the reference questions which are applicable to all the regions, but there are certain regions where you need much more probing questions if there are regional sensitivities or regional, say, areas which are not applicable to all. Then of course you could add more questions and ask them. You can make it localized to your needs. For example, in addition to this activity, what we tried to do in Lao was to do a HMIS a digital systems inventory, where we made a list of all the systems which are currently running in the country, which may be DHIS to non-DHIS to. We just ask routine questions: who is responsible for the system? What is the purpose of the system? Who are the users? What data it captures? What data it produces? Does it produces indicators as per your national indicator repository? So then, in addition to what you assessed here, you also, in the same exercise, you're able to maintain a inventory of information systems in country. because it's important if you're running a lot of information systems, they need to be interoperable or at least have minimum capacity of exchanging data so that everything is consolidated together. So this is a standard reference. You can localize it to your context, and you can also, so I understand IOM works in a lot of countries and they use DHIS2 in many countries. So if any IOM country wants to do an assessment of their DHIS2 implementation, they could pick and select what questions they like to know. And then IOM could do a standard assessment across all the units that whether the IOM unit is using DHIS to do its best potential in terms of using the data which is getting collected, is the data quality maintained or not, and whether they have the infrastructure, the human resources available to support this implementation long term. So you could always customize it as per your needs. So it's flexible in that way.
Thank you. My name is Juan. I would like to ask a question regarding the recommendation that you just provided. In terms of the long-term support funders, how is HISP coordinating to support boundaries in terms of the long-term plan for, especially like the human support, looking at the system itself, the technology?
So if I understand question correctly, how is HISP supporting this process?
Yeah.
Okay. So basically, what has happened is up till now, the countries were free to do the assessment internally on their own if they were not willing to share the results to external audiences such as other partners, HISP, etc. So there is one way of doing it. But when HISP does it, they try to be as transparent as possible, and then they engage with experts from other HIS groups who come as external observers, assess the whole situation. And then since the HIS group who's working in that country works very closely with the Ministry of Health, they are able to get an external assessment of what are the areas they need to support the ministry in moving forward. So if HISP is involved in doing this assessment, then HISP can be instrumental in preparing the report, either through themselves or through external consultants. Then they could pitch in your donor meetings where they can say that we did this assessment, these are the findings, and these are the priority areas that the ministry has defined. And then HISP can recommend the action items for each of those areas, that for this we need investments in this. Based on the past experience that they've had in implementing similar systems in other countries, they know very clearly that for this particular component, what are the inputs which are required, and who is the right donor for those specific inputs if they have already invested in those areas in other countries in the region. So HISP can guide you through entire process of assessment, but can also be the communication mechanism of sharing the results of the assessment with your donors who are active in your country, and help them in making decisions that this is where the funding should go and these are the immediate needs. And this is what we've done in another country with similar investments, and we could replicate the same in this country as well. So HISP can become your partner in terms of implementing the recommendations which came out of the plan in collaboration with the donors who are willing to support HMIS implementations in the country.
Another question, how are you able to monitor in terms of the learning, like the debt process? How is it being monitored over time?
So we recommend doing this assessment. Say if we did this assessment this year, and then once the recommendations come out that for this particular process to improve, it will need 2 years of investment, a costed investment in the program for its improvement. Then if you have if you have invested that amount, the changes have been implemented on the field, repeat the assessment internally 2 years later or 3 years later. Okay, then you'll be repeating the same assessment, the same questions, and now you're asking it 3 years later. Then you can measure that in the last assessment we were at early progress, but with the investments and the implementation in the last 3 years, we have reached an adequate or mature position. So you can always use your first assessment as a baseline, and then you can keep repeating this assessment every 3 to 5 years and then compare results. So this way you can see that whether the investments which are done really benefited the respective components and what is the progress that you've achieved. So we don't recommend this as a one-time process. We recommend this as a continuous process where you can keep on doing assessments every 3 to 5 years and see the change that has happened with the funding that you were able to generate for those components. Okay, any more questions? All right. Okay, let's move to the next set of updates that we have on the current assessments in the region. So, as part of the Global Fund project, which I mentioned last year, we were able to assess 6 countries in the region: Afghanistan, Nepal, Myanmar, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. So they did their initial assessments in 2021-22, and out of that assessment, whatever key priorities came out of short-term technical assistance, the Global Fund team used those recommendations and priorities to fund those activities in the respective countries. So from 2001 to 23, based on the outputs of those assessments, the Global Fund invested in those countries, targeting on HIV, TB, malaria, and overall DHIS to capacity building and version upgrades. So a lot of technical assistances were done with us with the help of Global Fund support, which came out of the assessment which was done. Currently, what we're doing is we're doing a assessment of communicable disease surveillance systems and other strategic information sources within the WHO Southeast Asia region. A similar assessment was done in 2023 by another organization who covered 6 countries in that assignment. This year, we got awarded the contract to do the similar assessment in 3 countries: Indonesia, Myanmar, and Thailand, where we are working with the WHO Communicable Surveillance Review Unit at the Southeast Asia Regional Office. Swiss TPH is a collaborating partner who are providing the domain expertise, and his groups in India, Indonesia, and Vietnam are working in these countries to act as the information technology and the HMI support partner to collect information and do assessments and with the Swiss TPH team and the WHO country offices in these countries. So the methodology that has been followed for this assessment has 4 main components. The first one is a scoping review, where we started with involving collecting data from existing surveillance systems in the CRO member states, the 3 countries that we talked about. And we worked with the Swiss TPH team to do a comprehensive literature review to capture any publications, articles, donor reports, partner reports are published over the last 10 years for the key communicable diseases, which the WHO unit highlighted that we need assessment on these, to develop a scoping review document where we were able to see. And then we also developed a data extraction matrix where we defined 25 key indicators. And for those 25 key indicators, we referenced each of these publications done over last 10 years and the government reports, the reports released by partners, or any assessment which was done for communicable diseases in last 10 years to develop that data extraction framework, which kind of gave us the background information of how the country currently collects data for communicable diseases and how is that data used for response mechanisms. In addition to the scoping review, we developed a IT survey where we are conducting right now interviews with different national programs from communicable diseases in terms of getting information on their current practices of data collection, data use, data analysis, data quality measurement, and how they use that data for response for outbreaks. So this was developed to act as an additional information source above the scoping review and literature search which was done to validate the findings which we found in the gray literature and fill in the gaps which were not available as part of the initial scoping review. Using these 2 data sources, the next steps that I want to do is to build an evaluation framework with the WHO Southeast Asia Regional Office and define mechanisms where use these findings of the assessment, the interviews and the gray literature search that has been done to build an evaluation report, which the WHO plans to use to build a regional draft framework of handling communicable surveillance systems in countries. So give recommendations, guidelines, toolkits of how a country can use best practices from the countries that have been assessed to further strengthen their surveillance systems, specifically for communicable diseases. So currently we are working on step 2. We are collecting data from the countries in question, and these are the next 2 steps that we intend to do by end of this year, so that the regional office can release the draft framework for feedback from different countries and consolidate that as recommendations from WHO moving forward. In addition, I mentioned about the Lao DHIS to maturity assessment that we did last week. So the WHO country office in Lao proposed to the Department of Planning and Finance, who are responsible for managing the DHIS implementation in the country, to do a maturity assessment, and HISP groups from India and Vietnam work together. So before doing the on-site visit, the HISP India team did scoping review where they looked at previous documents of the assessments that have been done for in Lao by different partners, and the publications that were done on Lao HMIS or DHIS implementation in the past, to get a background of the entire 10 years of the implementation of the Lao DHIS2. And then we did a week-long visit where we met different departments, the Department of Planning and Finance in particular, since they are the agency who's coordinating the HMIS efforts in country. And then we met the HMIS team and all the national programs to collect information on the basis of the DHIS maturity assessment tool. So currently we're documenting the outcomes of the tool. And within those, the dialogue that we have with the country for a week, we were able to identify issues with data quality, use of data, capacity of people to make decisions using data. And we had a very honest conversation with the country in terms of they knowing very well that these are the areas they lack and they need support. So I think that assessment gave a good reflection of where the DHIS implementations is present and what are the priorities that can be conveyed to the donors who are active in Lao to support these further initiatives in country. So yeah, so these are some examples of how the assessments are being carried out in the region, and these could be replicated to your countries as well in case of if it's required. And generally, we recommend having these assessments done, as you mentioned, starting with the baseline and doing more frequent assessments so that you know how you're progressing and where you need to move forward in this whole approach. So if you have any further questions on the assessment and you want to know the experience of other countries where we have assessed, we are available for support. And I think we have the reports available also. Some of them are available on public platforms, so we can share links of some reference reports which you can review and see what outcome the maturity tool produces and how you can use the same tools for your countries as well. So yeah, so any more questions on the assessment frameworks? So as discussed, we'll share the links for the tools with you so that you can review that. And if there are any more questions, please feel free to come to us and we'll try our best to answer those questions. All right, so I think we had to look at the assessments for the overall HMIS. As per the agenda, we also wanted to cover and introduce the core team assessments toolkits and documentation that has been developed, which gives you a reflection on what a DHIS to core team should be in terms of positions, core positions, contributory positions, what should be their job descriptions, and how that core team can work. And for that core team, how you can draft a capacity building plan and get that funded to partners or interested to build capacity of DHIS2 in country. So we'll cover all these topics and we'll also show this guidance material of where it's available and how it can be assessed and used for countries. And especially for the countries who are starting DHIS2 implementation now, it's very important that they get an idea of how they can set up and facilitate capacity of the core team in country. So I'll request Shurajit, to please come and take the next part of the session.
Okay, thank you, Saurabh. So what I wanted to talk to you about today was the development of what we call a DHIS2 core team. Now, maybe if you heard this term before, maybe you haven't. We haven't really had it very well defined up until this point. It's been just kind of a mix of ideas, more than kind of a guiding principle that we can really focus on. But many of you have core teams. Many of you are working on building your core teams and have been for some time. And that progress has been very critical. The idea was to present a bit of a framework that can be standardized and subsequently adopted by various locations, countries, partners, etc. And once again, I will emphasize that this is a framework. And what I mean by that is it's a reference. So nothing that I'm giving you is gospel. It means you can change it, you can modify it, use it to fit your own needs. But the idea is to at least give you some reference so you can get started from somewhere, rather than giving you this idea of, well, what a core team might be, but not giving you the appropriate guidance to build that, or at least give you a starting point where you can build your own teams, or maybe capacitate your teams that are already there and have been there for some time. So what we want to do in this session, in this part of the session, is define what a DHIS2 core team is, and then review the core team tool components. So I won't spend a ton of time on kind of explanatory principles, but I'm going to spend a bit more time just discussing the various parts of the toolkit and how you can use them in your own settings. All right, so just starting with what a core team is. All right, so what we've done is try to define kind of the minimum roles that are required in a particular setting. This doesn't mean that it applies to you one for one. Maybe you have some suggestions or some alterations or something else that you might need, right? But the idea is to give a bit of a framework, like I said, to get you started. And we built all our tools around this framework, and you'll see that in a moment, to develop a kind of standardized methodology to build the team. But if you decide to add in new roles or move things around, that's completely fine, right? Then you just modify the toolkit to meet your needs. So what we've done, or what we're kind of saying, so core teams manage the planning, implementation, and evaluation of DHIS2. So they're kind of acting as the end-to-end support of DHIS2 in the country. And they're meant to be staff that have a mixed set of competencies. So not just solely focused on information technology or computer science or networking and infrastructure or public health, but actually a mix of these individuals with various skills that bring their own perspective to the table. Okay. Ideally, they're formed at the beginning of when you're starting your customization process, right? But for some of you, you're very mature already. You've been doing this for years, okay? I think a lot of this can also help even in those scenarios. Okay. So what we've done is define 4 core positions and 4 contributing roles. Now, once again, this is just to get started. Doesn't mean that every country will look the same, okay? Or you can't make any changes. So the 4 roles, the 4 core roles that we define are operational lead, trainer, implementer, and this is split into 2 categories, program and technical implementer, and a server administrator. Now, outside of the server administrator, we suggest that those other 3 roles are filled by full-time people. Server administrator, depending on the infrastructure and how things are set up in the country, it might not have 100% level of effort just managing DHIS2, okay? It depends on the situation. They could, not to say they can't, but in many scenarios, they might not. We then have contributing roles, and what contributing roles are, they're roles that they have a core position, their regular work, their day-to-day job, but they contribute to DHIS2 when it's necessary for their input. So these are people like program managers, right, who have insight into how their program is managed and delivered, subject matter experts, maybe they could be partners, they could be internal to a ministry, who understand how to analyze and interpret the data and how to translate that into subsequent public health action. Okay, we have app developers who you might need to help you build some custom tooling for integration or analysis or whatever it might be, and security managers, right, who understand security concepts like the ISO standards, etc., and know how to apply them in your setting, especially if you're dealing with a lot of personal identifiable information, right? Okay, so just quickly to define these four roles, these core roles. So we have the operational lead, and they're like the project manager, okay? So they will liaise with various departments, they'll bring everybody together, they might perform some various facilitation and coordination, they'll deal with development partners, maybe, they'll write up proposals, and they'll kind of ensure, they'll have an oversight of the entire kind of system, right? Whether it's in one department or another, it doesn't matter. As long as it's something in DHIS2, they should have some insight into how it's being run, right? And this can help them build an integrated design of how all these different components fit together, and also how they will fit with other components outside of DHIS2, right? So one idea with this framework is to recognize that DHIS2 is not going to be the only system that you're working with, right? Often you have many other systems that you need to deal with. We have then the trainer position. So they'll help build you your documentation, they'll perform trainings, and it's various levels of training, right? Could be expert levels of training where they receive some support from somebody on a specific configuration aspect or something advanced. It could also be end user training, right? Just training people how to enter data, how to review the data on a monthly basis, how to review their analysis of data whenever they want, right? We have this implementer role, and this is split up into two roles, as I mentioned. So one is technical and one is program, okay? And the reason why I've separated this is just because their roles are a little bit different, and maybe their experience and how they interact with the programs can also be different. So on the program side, you will have someone who can talk to programs, who understands public health workflow, who can build and draft requirements, right? And kind of manage those to the people who will actually then configure the system. So then on that implementer technical side, you have people who know how to configure DHIS2, maybe perform some advanced operations, like working with the API to import data, to import metadata, to kind of move the configuration along more quickly. Okay, so we have this separation of roles at this level, depending on what they're working with. Now, you could have a person who's conversant in both, though I would say that's becoming more and more rare these days due to the specialization of skills required. And then we have the server administrator role. They manage your servers, install DHIS2 updates, install Linux updates, add all those performance monitoring tools, monitor those tools, do all that stuff, right? Yes.
Perspective, go back to the Yeah, actually, the reason why I would ask this question is that things like most of the company, they will try to hire developers who are very much focused on developing app. So where do you put them in that particular operation as an implementer in that particular role? Because like they don't understand the requirement gathering from the programs.
So if you have an app developer and they're meant to configure, because yeah, we have this problem actually, because sometimes you have them building apps, but sometimes they're hired to configure DHIS2. So in that case, they'd be more on the technical implementation side, because then they can really speed up the configuration process. They can write all kinds of scripts and make tools. They can help build apps to even manage the configuration, and it can really speed things up. Now, of course, if you're building apps on top of DHIS2, they can also serve that role. So, John and his team have presented a couple different apps. We'll see some more in the other days. If they are building some type of custom requirements for you that you need, and you need those maintained, that can also be useful to keep them as a resource. Whether or not they're doing both, it depends kind of on their workload, I suppose. Yeah, so we would kind of put them in that technical implementer category. Okay, so I think this slide's quite important because what we're doing is moving away from our previous messaging. So when we talked about building DHIS2 capacity in the past, we always had all kinds of messaging. Anybody can do anything inside of DHIS2. Doesn't matter what your background is, doesn't matter where you're from. You could be a doctor, can configure DHIS2. What we're seeing now is that we have to move away from that model, okay? More and more it's becoming important that a person's education and experience contributes to the DHIS2 skills that they subsequently learn. So there is a lot more specialization only because the system there's more complex requirements these days, right? It's not so simple as just making a simple aggregate form and having that up and running. And sometimes that's there, but then sometimes there are much more advanced areas that require a lot of thought before you even start configuring. And then when you start configuring, there's a lot of advanced skills you also need these days to actually do that in an efficient manner. So rather than say everyone can do anything, we're saying that there are people that might be set up for success if they have the right background and experience, okay? And it might be the case even where if you've identified someone to take a certain role and they don't have that background experience, it might be worthwhile sending them for a little bit of extra education. So that's also part of the capacity building planning. It's not just building DHIS2 skills, because for one, they won't just be dealing with DHIS2 in all likelihood, okay? But it's also making sure they have the right background knowledge. A server administrator who's never logged into Linux is probably not a good idea, okay? As an example. Okay? And having the programmer who's never been to a facility contribute to public health data analysis, also probably not a good idea. So that's what we mean when we say the background is more important these days in terms of assessing and understanding what skills you should set someone to learn, right? You shouldn't just pick at random, but you should be really targeted in whom you select to fill these roles. And if they don't have the experience or background they need, then you should set them on a pathway to gain that before you can start teaching them DHIS2 skills, because the foundation has to be there first before trying to teach these skills at this point in time, only because things have moved in a more complex direction. Okay, so in terms of building the team, so we know there are sometimes resource constraints. Sometimes it's not necessarily the case, but the whole idea is that this is not a short-term project, right? So if you're building this team, a long-term vision is needed and also long-term funding is needed. So skills are not developed overnight. That's another area we should emphasize. We have the academy program, you have in-country trainings, you have all kinds of stuff. But if you're thinking about real mastery of these skills, it's not that you can just attend one course and all of a sudden you're going to be an expert in everything, right? You need a plan to develop these skills over a period of time. And depending on where they start, it could be shorter or longer. You know, once again, it depends a bit on that background experience and skills that they have. So we suggest starting with that operational lead. This is the program or project manager, let's say. And of course, they should ideally have some DHIS2 skills, even though they'll kind of be liaising with partners, etc. It's very important that they understand how DHIS2 works, because sometimes ideas are proposed and they're not always kind of the best solution, right? So it's important to also understand what can be accepted and implemented successfully, even though you haven't started that project yet, right? Okay. And then we kind of suggest adding in these other roles as necessary, depending on funding and financing and time, okay? All right, so we've kind of defined what the team is. And once again, it's a framework, so you can modify the roles, the responsibilities, etc. But what we wanted to do was define something standard so we could build kind of from start to finish all the tools that would contribute to building this team, right? And if you change those roles, you should probably then change all the tooling that's also kind of applied to these various roles. So we have this core team toolkit, and it basically looks at 3 components. We have a needs assessment, which goes through all these different roles and figures out or identifies kind of gaps in their skills and where they can learn more, okay? So the first thing is actually identifying for each person in your team that you've identified, well, what do they need to learn, right? That's the basic premise, okay? Then we have a template, which helps you to plan these activities and come up with a bit of a budget for this. And this is not for just one training, okay? This is over a prolonged period of time. So in our template, it's for 3 years, for example. That can be expanded or reduced depending on what you're looking at, but this is not a one-time solution, right? Lastly, we have the implementation component. So at some point, you're going to need to train them. You're going to need to give them transfer of skills, on-the-job coaching, whatever it is, right? So we have various facilities, various types of information to basically help you build your training programs. Mix of material, approaches, models, etc. Okay, so I just wanted to go over this in the next like 10 minutes that we have, just to show you what's available. So first thing I'll open is our implementation guidance. And this guidance, so the links are all in this presentation. It's been shared with you. But of course, if there are any questions about it, let me know. Okay. So all of the basic kind of principles that I've discussed are available in this documentation. So we see that the positions that I mentioned are here. It has more information on each of this. We have detailed role descriptions, a bit more than what I had in the slide. Okay. Different competencies for the team, different principles. So there's basically a lot more information on what a core team is and how that team can be built, including things like mitigation measures, retention strategies, strategies to kind of keep them on the team. We know that there's an issue, obviously, with salaries in the ministries of health. It's often hard to navigate that when we know that development partners exist and often salaries are higher, right? And once you learn marketable skills, people can move, right? So there is a market for these skills and we recognize that. So we try to also address this to some extent. Okay, so the idea of this guidance is basically to provide you with a lot more detail of what I've just mentioned, going over these team members, what they do, etc. And yes, there's all kinds of other information here for you to review. Okay. So that's kind of the overarching document that discusses these three components that I've just mentioned, right? The needs assessment, planning and budgeting of activities, and the implementation. We talk about that all within the guidance. Now then we have separate components that contribute to each of these pillars, okay? So the first part is the needs assessment. Okay, so what we've done is developed a tool for you, and it has kind of some instructions on how you run the assessment. And what it's meant to do is to assess each individual in your team. Now, that could be a new team, that could be a team that's already mature. Hey, it doesn't really matter, right? And what we've done, we have the 4 roles that I've talked about previously, the operational lead, our 2 types of implementers, our trainer and our server admin. And then we have a list of skills associated with each role. Okay, so if I go to the needs assessment itself, so this is the document. Basically, we have our various roles, and then we rate them basically on a scale of 1 to 4, okay, not yet achieved, all the way over to mature. And we have descriptions for each of the kind of skills that we're trying to assess within there. And the idea is basically, if I'm looking at this person and I have an operational lead, oh my God, sorry, this scrolling is opposite for me. Let's see if I can get it out. I'll use the keyboard here. Okay, so let's say we've identified a person as an operational lead, whether they're existing in place and they're very experienced, okay, or whether it's somebody new, right? You're just starting in your implementation. Okay, and you realize that they've not really had a lot of experience up until date in terms of writing proposals and sharing those with development partners. Okay, if that's the case, then it could be an area where they need some support in order to learn that specific skill. Right, so in the tool itself, you're able to just score the individual. And I shouldn't say a score, it's more of a rating. The idea is to encourage people to be honest with their responses and not penalize them for their responses. So if a person does not yet know a skill and they feel shy about that or a little embarrassed, let's say, we want to encourage them that this is going to be used as a tool to make a learning development pathway for them, not to penalize them because they don't know something. Okay, so it's really kind of the opposite messaging that we're looking for, is make sure people are honest with their responses and reward them for their honesty rather than penalize them for not knowing something. So especially at the beginning, when you're forming these teams, you might not be able to find someone with all these skills, right? Maybe your server admin knows a lot about Linux, but has never used Ansible. Okay, they can probably learn that, right? So it's not to penalize them for not knowing that skill if they don't have it already, especially if they have a lot of foundational skills that you need in order to be successful in those roles. Okay? So from the get-go, you're not trying to have someone with all these skills, but you do want to assess them on these skills in order to see if there are certain gaps or areas where they need some support in order to learn specific skills that will help them in their roles. So we have this implementer program. It goes through many DHIS2 specific kind of concepts. We have this technical implementer role. There's a bit of DHIS2, there's a bit of non-DHIS2 stuff here, because there's importing and exporting and dealing with some scripts, etc. That might not necessarily be specific to DHIS2, okay? So the idea is for each skill, you rate them. And for the skills that you don't really think apply to them, like for example, if you are hiring someone to work as the server admin, maybe they don't necessarily need to know how to write a proposal, right? So you might want to remove some of those lines before you give the assessment to them. Or if you're sitting down and assessing them by yourself as a supervised exercise, then you might want to just remove those sections that don't apply to them. Okay, so this is kind of the first step in the process. After you, of course, you've identified who will be part of your team, right? You might have a team existing already. In that case, it makes things a little easier because you should assess them on skills that they need. Now, once again, maybe some of these roles don't necessarily align with your existing structure, right? You might have people in place already that are performing very similar tasks, but it's not one-to-one, right? In that case, you would just want to modify this a little bit and insert those skills that are required for them to be successful in the performance of that particular role. Okay, so once again, it's meant to be a guiding example rather than like something you use one-to-one. You can do that, but you don't need to. Okay, so we start with that assessment. We assess each person in our team, whether they're new or whether they've been there for a long time. Okay, and then we have to decide what we do with the results. Okay, so we have two tools to help with this. So the first one I'm going to talk about is what we call our learning paths tool. I'll just give this a second to load. Okay, so what you'll see in this tool are the same 8 roles that I've been discussing, right? And the idea is to give you some idea if they're going to be in that role, what are the types of training that they should receive? Now, what it has on here are academy courses, DHIS2 academies, but it doesn't mean they need to go to all these academies, right? They go to one. If they don't, it doesn't matter. But the idea is they should gain the knowledge that exists within that material, within that content. So that could be through an in-country training. Maybe a HISP provides you some help at the beginning. Maybe it's something you do yourself as you gain experience, right? That could be on-the-job coaching. It could be online mentoring, right? It doesn't always have to be a very expensive exercise where you send someone away for training. Okay, so if I select one of these roles, okay, it's going to then highlight the various courses that it suggests for that role. Okay, and once again, it's meant to highlight the learning content that they should receive, not attending all these academies. That's going to be extremely expensive and not really efficient use of funding. Maybe they can attend 1 or 2, but they don't need to attend all, right? So if we select one of these, if I just reset this here, okay, so it'll give you the role. It'll give you the recommended courses for that role. It'll highlight them in this little diagram that's available. Okay, and I'll just reset this. And let's say it's this particular course I'm interested in. I'll give you some information on this course as well as a link to that course. Like I said, we have all, or I haven't mentioned this yet, I guess, but we have all our learning material online, right? It's not always videos and stuff, but we have all the manuscripts written on all those sessions, you know, in terms of our learning design, in terms of all our exercises, etc. So if someone wants to learn something and has a bit of self-motivation, they can go through that material as well, rather than, you know, having to be sent away and learn. Of course, that's an option, but it's not always needed. That material can also be used to kind of help you build your own learning content, and I'll discuss that in a moment. Okay, so we have the assessment paths tool, which will maybe help us address some of that we identify in our assessment. And then we have this core team capacity building plan. Okay, so the idea here is to identify for each person in your team, what are the various kind of learning pathways for that individual, right? And each individual might have different learning pathways depending on their roles and responsibilities. Some of them have similar roles, especially if you have a bigger team, right? If you have a team of 15 people, sharing the same role, then there might be some learning that can be performed together, right? It's not always something that has to be separate or unique, just depends on what they're doing. But you can see here, this is a 2-year plan of basically identifying some of the training they will receive over the next 2 years in order to kind of advocate basically for this. Because the tough thing with this is it needs to be funded, right? In addition to identifying these activities, you need to find money to support these activities. And that's why I mentioned, sending just to academies, it's not really an efficient way to do things all the time. There are other ways that are more cost efficient that can be kind of stressed a little bit more. But I think if you have something like this in place, it's a little bit easier to go to a partner and say, we have a plan for each of our staff. This is what they need to learn. This is why we want this training, rather than just kind of say, okay, we've implemented this system. Let's have this training in the next couple of weeks. Let's move on to the next thing. Okay, now we need another training, et cetera, and that cycle proceeds. So the idea is to have a structured plan rather than do this in an ad hoc manner. Okay. Now for each of these positions below, we have detailed job descriptions as well in this template that goes over the type of work tasks that they're performing, the type of different qualifications they might need, et cetera. So if you're looking to kind of hire people, or you're looking to adjust someone's role, or maybe even just adjust their TOR to actually meet their current responsibilities, there are some kind of templates you could look at in order to get some information in order to do that. Okay. So in this template, we also have a budget. We also have an accompanying Excel tool. I mean, it's just making a budget, right? It's not anything new maybe for everybody, but it's just something that has to be done, right? So once we identify those activities, we need to make sure we identify. First, we just are estimating how much they cost, okay? Because we made a plan, now we have to know how much it actually costs to implement that plan. We might not have it funded yet, right? In that case, we need to go to partners and build advocacy for this. And they might not give us everything we need, as we know is often the case, but at least if they give you something, you can get started, right? Okay, so we've done our assessment. We have some tools that are kind of inputting into our plan. We've built our plan. We've identified for each person what type of training we think they should receive, and we've made an estimate of what this costs. Okay. Okay, and then once you get the money to actually do that stuff, you might have to build some training programs inside to build your teams. These could be custom training programs. Let's say, for example, an app developer who needs some very specific kind of learning, languages, programming languages or frameworks or whatever it might be. Okay, maybe some fire training, whatever. Okay, and that doesn't necessarily have to be like a DHIS2 thing either, right? Some of these skills that they're learning could be completely kind of tangential to DHIS2. Maybe a subject matter expert needs a bit of extra knowledge on using some type of statistical tool, for example, for interpreting the DHIS2 data. So there are both DHIS2 skills that we kind of can emphasize, as well as those kind of skills, like I said, these foundational skills that can be built on. So let's say we make this plan, we get our money, and now we have to do some training, okay? So what we've done is try to develop a couple resources to help you implement training in your own settings. You can attend an academy as well, that's there. Oh, yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, sure. Take some questions.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I think it's good to get some question along the way. So it's assessment tool, as a core team assessment toolkit, I mean, can be used to also establish the core team, right? For someone or some country that doesn't have it yet. First one. And I think all the question there is mostly subjective, not objective, right? It's really based on our own assessment or someone assessment, right? And also, I understand you have a competency plan, or based on the assessment, we plan for the capacity building. And then once it's done, we have to do the assessment again, or, I mean, someone got to a training, but doesn't mean that he or she can do the job, right? So we should do again the assessment. And another question is that I think I saw you put the cost, because the building capacity will involve costing. So in terms of business process, I'm thinking like whether we should invest more on the building capacity at the national level or the government staff? Or should we invest in the external support? Like how to balance that? Which one have more co-effective? Thank you.
Let me see if I can remember both questions. Okay, so the first one I think was in terms of establishing a new team. So yes, it has a dual purpose, right? You can either use this to establish a new team or to strengthen an existing team, right? Whether that means looking at some of the roles and kind of adjusting what's already there, or just kind of making your own plan based on this reference. Or if you don't have anything in place and you're starting from scratch, then it's a good time to evaluate, well, what do I actually need in place to be successful? Who are the people? What are the resources? What is the cost? What type of training will they need, etc. And it's a good thing to also, have this conversation if someone is supporting you on that. It's a good thing to have that conversation with them as well if you're just starting, because they can help you also define based on the context. This will vary a little bit, right? It won't be exactly, like I said, one-to-one. So you might want to kind of change things a little bit, but it absolutely can be used to establish new teams. The idea is that's why we have all these terms of references, for example, because you might need to recruit new people, or you might need to take an existing person and modify their current job. Okay, that's why we have all these kind of skills assessment, because you might not know all the DHIS2 stuff, but it's important to then identify, well, what do they need to learn, right? Okay. So sorry, I can't quite remember the second question. Yes, okay. So yeah, the idea is because these are individual assessments that you do have follow-ups ever so often. I wouldn't say you do it necessarily right after a training, because like I said, this whole notion of attending one training and then mastering a skill, this is something we are working on kind of reducing the expectation, right? If they attend one training and they practice for so much time, then it might be, they might be at a stage where the expectations then align for them to maybe be, have that skill mastered, right? But if, for example, they've attended some configuration training and they've learned a lot of stuff, and then you expect them all of a sudden they're going to be able to manage all the sharing in a production system right after that training, it's often not a realistic expectation. So you would want to give some time before you do that assessment again. So let's say on an annual basis, for example, rather than doing it right after each and every training. But the idea is the tool is individual, so you would want to update the assessment as you proceed. And you had one more question, right? Yeah, okay. Okay, so we always advocate for building internal capacity as much as possible, okay? Because really with DHIS2, the whole idea is that there's local ownership of the system. And that doesn't mean you own the data or the server or et cetera. But if you need to respond quickly, there's an outbreak, there's a disaster, there's something where you need to implement a new set of data collection tools, train people, modify things. If you have local capacity, then you can do that a lot easier. Now, of course, the idea is with the external experts is in advanced situations, right? Because many people involved in this process, even if they're involved in a core team, they'll be serving some other role. So they're like managing many hats. It's often difficult to sit down and just focus on DHIS2, right? So that's a kind of practical recognition we have to make. But then that's why we have external partners, we have HISP groups, we have all kinds of people all over the globe who are kind of dedicating their time to this. So when there's kind of advanced matters that you're not really able to solve, that's where we often kind of would advocate for partnerships with a HISP group so they can help you kind of manage that, or anybody, I should say, manage that a bit more, right? When it's kind of beyond the point of what you know naturally, and it's becoming too difficult to kind of do in an effective and efficient way, then there's often a lot of partners to do this. But then, the idea is to build as much local capacity as you can. And like I said, this will take some time, maybe to get to a point where you'd be as proficient as someone who's been doing this for several years. But the idea is to kind of focus on building local capacity where possible. Yeah. Was there any other questions? Yeah.
Hello, I am Usama from Pakistan. So I want to know something regarding this capacity building need assessment. So once we have defined the role operation lead. So if I want to just mention that in Pakistan or in some government organizations, they have limited resource, human resource, and some person is doing multiple tasks. So how we will be coping that? For example, is a technical implementer and he's also doing some training jobs as well. So how we can actually manage that and how we can map these roles. Plus, and if a operational lead, we are asking these questions, set of questions, and how we can actually judge if he is honest in replying. So these are some core problems for addressing. So I need suggestions how to deal these problems so we can actually build core team for different departments in government. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Osama. Yeah, those are good questions. Okay, so for the first question in terms of combining roles, I think that's very common, right? Most people who are on the implementation team are often doing training. If you only have an operational lead and they're well trained in DHIS2, that's the only DHIS2 person in the country, and they're going to be doing all kinds of stuff, right? So I think it's important to keep the expectations realistic, especially at the beginning, right? In terms of building up their skill set. What do you want them to focus on, right? If the idea is I need someone to configure DHIS2, then you should really have them kind of focus on this. If they're trying to do too many things at once, they get caught in this trap where they're not going to be able to excel in anything. But over time, I think it is prudent to say, okay, maybe this person has a couple different roles. They're going to be the operational lead, they're going to configure, they're going to train. That's very common, I would say, actually, for most people, because you have this intersection of skills. So in that case, you would want to assess them in various skill categories and create a learning and development pathway that includes, enhancement in all those different skill areas, keeping in mind that there should be some space for them to learn at a reasonable pace, right? You can't just expect them to learn everything at once. I think that's the big thing. And that's something we also have to kind of talk to partners about and make sure that they understand this process. It can be a difficult conversation, both for that person as well as the development partner, right? Maybe they just want to learn everything and they're just saying, oh, DHIS2 is so easy. And especially we've done a bad job because that's what we've been saying for years, right? DHIS2 is so easy, anyone can do anything. So we have to kind of move away from that message though, to be a bit realistic and try to combine these roles a bit more holistically and give them a bit of time in order to do this. Yeah, sorry, the second question, Sama?
Second question was that if we are asking a person of he's the operational lead and how honest he is in replying. So how can we cope up with this issue?
So I think there are two ways of doing the assessment. One is a self-assessment. You share the questions and they fill it out. And the other is maybe more supervised, right? So you sit down with them and you go through the questions and you assess their responses. Try not to be too harsh at the time, I think, if you feel like their response is not genuine, right? But I think it's important to review that after the fact, especially if you sat down with them and then discuss, maybe they don't understand some of the stuff. So some of the implementation technical wording, for example, it's very technical. Maybe they don't really understand what the question is asking. And they just think that they're very good at that. So they want to say that, but maybe they're not and they need some help and there's some gaps there, right? So it really depends on how the assessment is administered and the knowledge of the person administering it, right? So one thing with the tool, you do require a bit of expertise because if people are filling things incorrectly and you don't really understand what the tool is asking, then of course you might just think they're being truthful and there's no real way to assess that. So there does have to be some oversight from somebody who understands what all this DHIS2 terminology is or what some of the kind of specific wording within the tool is in order to evaluate that. It shouldn't just be administered by anybody because then you might run into this problem where it's not necessarily administered by the right person and they can't evaluate if it's a truthful response. Okay, so we're well into the break. So I think I'm going to stop here actually for now. If there are any questions, I'll be around. I'll come outside and grab me. Feel free to do so. There's a couple other links I didn't get a chance to go through. You can open them up. It's just referencing some existing learning material and learning principles that can help you build your own learning material. Okay, so we'll end for that. We'll end this session for now. And yeah, thank you all for your attention. Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah.